Bob Rae, Mike Harris and Doug Ford. Everybody was looking at the recent Ontario election and saying, well, either we're going to go back to the early 90s or the late 90s. And unfortunately, we're in the late 90s. Not that the early 90s were much better. But there are very important lessons from this period for us today. And this is a missing history. It's typically very difficult to study near history because the stuff that happened a while ago has normally been fairly well studied and explained, and the stuff that's happening very recently, well, we all remember it. But the stuff that we only just missed is normally quite difficult to study. Because the resources are quite limited, and you really don't know who to trust, to be honest. I had to do a lot of readings to prepare this, and and it was coming from a variety of different perspectives. You've got left liberals like Thomas Walcombe, who's a journalist with the Toronto Star. You've also got NDP left. You've got various academics or sort of Marxians from a sort of people from the sectarian left, and you really have to take everything that was said with a large dose of skepticism, and frequently they contradict each other. So it makes it difficult to come to firm conclusions when you're not there yourself to actually make up your mind. So some of the conclusions I put forward have to be tentative to a certain degree because I'm not 100% certain of my source material. But it's still and the other thing that stops against a proper study and a proper understanding of this period is that, well, with respect to Bob Rae, nobody in the NDP wants to talk about Bob Rae. And the right-wing mantra about Bob Rae is totally hyperbolic. And then with respect to sort of Mike Harris, well, the Conservatives don't want to talk about Mike Harris, but also the Labour bureaucracy doesn't want to talk about Mike Harris because you had the fantastic general strike movement around the Metro Days of Action, so they don't want to talk about general strikes and illegal strikes, and all of these general strikes are illegal. And at the same time, they don't want to talk about how they completely capitulated and gave up. They especially don't want to talk about that. So it makes for a difficult task, but I hope comrades will bear with me. And the purpose of this, as they say, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And this is a period of both tragedy and farce, to paraphrase Marx, and there are many lessons for the coming fight against the populist right-wing Doug Ford government in Ontario, and possibly the coming CAC government in Quebec. So, comrades, if you don't feel as well acquainted in the period of the 90s, feel free to bring up current perspectives for Ontario and Quebec and other places in the discussion. All right. So it's kind of what's the word? It's a quite typical thing for social democracy to come to power in periods of crisis. The British Labour Party won power in both 1929 and 1974. So very, very bad times to win power in some ways, until they're faced in the middle of an economic crisis. But there's an inevitability towards this of capitalism in crisis seeks out the alternative party in order to get it through that period of crisis. And ironically, it is also in these periods of crisis, the periods when reformism shows all of its weaknesses. Reformism is based upon redistributing the wealth of capitalism, if it's actual reformism. But when capitalism isn't producing any wealth, reformism doesn't work. You can't get reformism in a period of counter-reforms. Right? That the reformists look to the period of, the, say, 50s and 60s of the historic boom period of capitalism as so-called the natural condition of capitalism, where they can share out the growth a little bit. But they never seem to come to power in those periods. They always come to power in periods of crisis. And this was the Bob Rae NDP government that won power almost accidentally in 1990. Didn't expect it. Rae didn't expect it. This also reflects the Notley NDP government in Alberta. That Notley was quoted as saying that she only believed they were going to win in the last week of the campaign. And yet, and also they came to power in a period of crisis, collapse in oil prices, an inability to get Alberta oil to market. Yes, in terms of, the discussion, the parallels with Alberta are also very clear. The Alberta NDP government has turned against the workers, refused to increase oil royalties. So the parallels are very stark, and are now enforcing public sector wage freeze and other cuts. So, similar dynamic. But the economic crisis in Ontario and Canada in the early 90s was one of the worst in the advanced capitalist world. So Canada didn't do so badly in the 1980 slump or the 2000 slump, but the one at the beginning of the 90s hit Canada especially hard, and Ontario even harder, the hardest of all. Ontario GDP, and here's an amazing thing. I read a number of books and a number of articles about the Bob Rae government. None of them include the GDP figures. None of them. So this is sort of ABC for Marxists. Of you start from the economic base and you look, and then you use that to illuminate the political superstructure. But so I had to go to Statistics Canada and find these numbers myself. They're numbers that are $2002, so they don't entirely match up to the quoted figures at the time, but it means that it accounts for inflation. So in Ontario GDP in 1989 was $342 billion. This had gone down by 2% to $336 billion in 1990, and then down another 4% in $323 billion in 2001. So this is an incredible cut. The budget deficit also. So they ended up posting a $10 billion deficit in 1991, a $14 billion deficit in 1992. So this is a more than a 4% budget deficit. So massive deficits. Unemployment went up by 50% in a year. So this is and the GDP, they didn't recover to 1989 levels of GDP until 1994, 5 years later. 5 lost years. The entire length of the Rae NDP government. And the right wing tries to sort of blame that on the NDP. And, well, there's some things definitely can be blamed for the NDP. But this was, this is the global crisis. It was a global crisis of capitalism, and the capitalists did their bit to exacerbate this. That there was a specific capital strike aimed against the Bob Rae government. That, and I'll come to that in a moment. But the initial reaction to the victory of the Rae government was euphoria amongst trade unions, amongst the left. That this wasn't expected, but it was like finally finally, the Canada's Social Democratic Labour Party has won power in the most populous province. Previously, the NDP won power in Saskatchewan, in BC, I think in Manitoba at the time, yeah, and but I never won power in Ontario, the industrial heartland of Canada, and this was a real opportunity for socialism, as it was seen, and the inauguration of the NDP government was at U of T's Convocation Hall. So like over 2,000 people were in attendance, great enthusiasm. One sort of trade union leader began up the chants of like, Premier Bob, Premier Bob. And, you know, it was the desire to sort of finally put in some reforms in favour of working class people was immense. Bob Rae immediately started to calm that down, saying, "Oh no, we have to govern for all the people. You know, we can't just be beholden to special interests." Right? His speech was incredibly damp, but which shows you which way he was heading. And of course, you know, govern for all the people is a watchword for we're not going to do anything to upset the rich and the powerful who currently run things. But the platform, so it was a modest reformist platform, quite similar to the NDP's platform in the recent Ontario election. So a key element of the platform was public auto insurance. They also had a commitment to reform corporate taxation and the tax structure, welfare reform, reform of the labour code, and equity legislation. So it was a modest reformist government that would have made modest advancements in the position of the working class if they had put any of it into practice, which is a big if. Well, they came to power and realised just how bad the economy was. But the first budget of the Rae NDP government were attempted to be sort of modest Keynesianists. Now this also, we have to see the period of the early 90s. So on a global scale, this was a period, the 90s were a period of reaction. You had the fall of the Soviet Union, the victory of capitalism, the defeat of socialism, if you like, and the advance of a free market, monetarist, sort of Hayek style, Milton Friedman economics. That Margaret Thatcher said there is no alternative. You must have balanced budgets, you must have cuts, you must have austerity to achieve balanced budgets. The invisible hand of the market will sort everything out. And so this was entirely dominant in general politics. And the defeat of the Soviet Union made that sort of even more dominant. Of course, we understand the Soviet Union wasn't genuine socialism, Stalinism, but that was the period of the time. And but they did actually try and be mild Keynesianists in their first budget. So Walcom, in his book called Rae Days, he sort of details it. They had about $2 billion of stimulative spending, and $8 billion, which was just the hole in their budget due to the economic crisis. Increased welfare, increased unemployment, increased expenditure, like that. And of course, $2 billion is very, very small, especially when the economy has gone down by $8 billion. So it's not really going to fill the hole. But even this very, very mild increase in sort of stimulative spending created an immense rate-baiting corporate backlash. And you saw this against the Notley government in the first days. Incredible corporate backlash. Conrad Black played a leading role in this. He led the effort for a capital strike. There are actually adverts in New York and Washington newspapers saying, "Don't invest in socialist Ontario." There were the National Citizens Coalition put up posters advertising in major areas. So, one of which, sadly, couldn't find a picture of this, had a picture of Marx, Stalin, Bob Ray. There's one that you can find on the internet. By the way, it's got a mouse trap that says like "kills mice, Bob Ray kills jobs," right? And it was just this incredible corporate backlash. There's a quote somewhere here from Conrad Black, basically accusing Bob Ray's government of expropriation and communism. Right? If only. But the government didn't have the ideological tools to fight back against this. Because Ray himself was, well, he was never a socialist, quite obviously, and actually came from a family of liberal government bureaucrats and diplomats. And actually, I think he was he was campaigning for Trudeau Senior in the 1968 Liberal Convention when Trudeau won the leadership of the Liberal Party, and only sort of came and was a roommate with Michael Ignatieff in university, and only came to the NDP when he became radicalized, but a little bit, when he was a student in Europe, and then he was on the right wing of the NDP students at U of T when he was there. So he was definitely not a left-wing leader, although interestingly, when he was he was a federal MP, and then he was encouraged to run as the leader of the Ontario NDP in the early 80s. He was supported by the entire union bureaucracy, including QP and CAW and all of those unions that would come into conflict with him later. So, but yeah, the reformists had no way to oppose this corporate backlash, and because the only way to oppose it is to mobilise the mass of the working class, and of course that's the last thing that the Ray bureaucracy wished to do. But there's interesting, there's two different perspectives on this. There's a book by sort of NDP left-wingers called Giving Away a Miracle. And it's actually, Walcombe had an interesting perspective on why the right-wing propaganda was so successful, was that he was sort of blaming, let's say, the people in the Ray government were angry at the unions and the sort of what's the term? Sort of the NGOs, that sort of the social activists, for not campaigning against the right wing, and so the unions were essentially passive, and the left was essentially passive against the right wing onslaught, allowing them to dominate the political argument. But the Giving Away a Miracle folks, they were saying, well, actually, the government was trying to co-opt all of the unions and the left, and everybody who was a little bit active on the left suddenly found themselves in a governmental bureaucratic job and were silenced. Right? And it's probably a bit of both. It's probably a bit of both, that so the unions sort of withdrew pressure, campaigning, they said, no, we'll give the government an opportunity to have its say and do its bit. So basically the entire left the scene of political battle and left it to the right wing. And so it was essentially the Ray government versus the corporate right-wing backlash. And there was nothing to the left of the government to put pressure the other way. And so I think everybody agrees that this was a massive mistake. And whether the fault for that mistake is the unions who were just withdrawing themselves and saying, well, the government will do it for us, or whether it was the government's fault for co-opting all of the left, well, it's a bit of both. And so that's why we were very clear in our demands around the Ontario election about whether it's an NDP or a Doug Ford victory, that you needed to build a mass movement against the inevitable, against the right wing. If the NDP had won, you'd need a mass movement to counter the corporate backlash and demand that the NDP actually follow through with its reforms and not stop there but go further. And in the event of the Doug Ford victory that we've seen, you need a mass movement to oppose the inevitable attacks from the Conservatives. So you can't just sort of leave yourself to the government to do it all. And again, this follows into the reformist ideology of the state being a neutral arbitrator. Or not neutral arbitrator, an empty vessel, if you like. That, the state is a neutral vessel and whoever wins the election fills it with their own content. They're like, well, no, it's a capitalist state that functions for the interests of the capitalists, and we shouldn't expect it to be otherwise. And the advantage of having the victory of to use Lenin's terms, a bourgeois workers' party, or bourgeois labour party, a reformist party in there, is that it should be more amenable to the pressure of the working class than an out-and-out capitalist party. And it is an important part in the consciousness, development of the consciousness of the working class in understanding the limits of reformism and the need to struggle for revolutionary socialism. Okay, so you got this massive corporate backlash, and you can see which way the government was going. And the first, interesting that one of the first setbacks was, it seems kind of accidental, but it was the purging of left-wing Welland MPP Peter Kormos. And he was one of the NDP's parliamentary caucus was incredibly inexperienced. That I think 40 or 50 of them had never been MPPs before. In cabinet, only half of them have been MPPs before. It was like 12 and 12. And Peter Kormos was a left-wing lawyer from Welland. It was quite iconoclast, so very politically incorrect. The workers loved him. He was known as the socialist cowboy. Yeah. He used to wear sort of denim suits, cowboy boots, and a big cowboy hat. And but the way that Bob Ray Ice picked him was yeah, that's a joke for some people at the back. So one of the most vile rags is the Toronto Sun. It's to this day utterly terrible publication. Although I would encourage everybody, read the Toronto Sun. Learn from the Toronto Sun. There is a style of writing. Learn from them stylistically. Don't learn from them politically. But the style of writing from the Toronto Sun is very simple, clear, and understandable to working class people, to those who have not had a university education. And you can learn from that. Of course, from an utterly opposed class perspective, it's total lies and manipulation and disgusting. Just to go with the the lies, the manipulation, the Toronto Sun has this tradition of sunshine girls, scantily clad women, and I think they still have sunshine girls, and occasionally the sunshine boys, right, to even things out a bit. And so Peter Cormus appeared as a sunshine boy to really sort of underline the ridiculousness of it all. And he was a sunshine boy, fully clothed in cowboy boots and cowboy hats. And for this, he was fired from cabinet by Bob Rae. Wow. Yeah. Which actually created huge problems for the Rae government, because every time there was even some minor scandal, it was brought up, well, you fired Cormus for being a sunshine boy. This is obviously way worse than that. Why aren't you firing this cabinet member? But Cormus was responsible for public auto insurance. Wonder if that was coincidental. Left-wing MPP, responsible for public auto insurance, fired for spurious reasons. In fact, actually, he was fired. He didn't resign. Rae brought him into his office, demanded he resign. Cormus told him to F himself, and then he was fired the following day. Right, not a good sign. And yes, this prepared the way on the 1-year anniversary of the NDP government. So like 1-year anniversary is typically a time for the government to say, this is what we've done for the people who elected us. What do? They betrayed on their 1-year anniversary, and they abandoned the public auto insurance, the one major signature reform that was supposed to be the legacy of the government. Right? And this created this huge disappointment amongst people. And that was just the beginning. Now, they began the sort of reform of the Labour Code, and again, this was sort of an incredible focus of the corporate backlash. But the unions didn't sufficiently campaign in favour of it, and it allowed, and under the right-wing pressure, they gutted a lot of the progressive changes to the Labour Code. But they did eventually pass some reforms. So they passed anti-scab legislation and card check certification of unions in some sectors, or they watered this down quite considerably. But this was pretty much the only half-positive thing the Rae NDP government did, and that was it. They weren't going to put up with the corporate backlash anymore, and the general tendency was to the right from then on. This came the social contract. Comrades have probably heard about this. That it's really not much of a contract. It was demanding massive cuts, $2 billion of cuts from public sector workers, another $2 billion of cuts from public services. It generated $2 billion in tax increases, although those mostly hit the middle class, and nothing for corporate taxation. No increase for corporate taxation, despite the commitment to reform corporate taxation and to reform the tax code. Utter betrayal, asking for, and this eventually led to the famous Rae Days, which were 12 unpaid days off per year for 3 years. So a significant cut in the wages of the workers. and ripping up public sector contracts. An NDP government ripping up workers' contracts. And at the same time, strictly enforcing every corporate contract. Like they completely sold out to the multinational drug corporations. And it actually, even from a sort of like a economic nationalist or even provincialist perspective, you had generic drug corporations based in Ontario, and Ray would not break the contracts with the multinational brand name drug manufacturers, and favour cheaper generic drugs, and that cost the healthcare system billions more on paying for that. So, a corporate contract was solid, but a workers' contract was ripped up. And so this is incredible betrayal. So this is sort of an ABC of trade unionism, ABC of social democratic reformism. It's not even socialism. Is you respect workers' contracts? No, rip them up. And this led the unions to finally end their silence and go into opposition. But it led to a sort of a big division within the labour movement between the Common Front unions, led by Canadian Auto Workers and CUPE, with Buzz Hargrove and Sid Ryan as major figures on the one side, and then the Pink Paper unions, with Leo Gerard of the Steelworkers, who's head of the Canadian part of the International Brotherhood of Steelworkers. Is it Brotherhood? I don't know. But the Steelworkers being an international union rather than a Canadian union. And he's currently actually the international president of the Steelworkers, Leo Gerard. But they opposed the social contract, but was saying, "Oh, we can't break with the NDP, and we've got to participate and negotiate with the government." Right? But the anger actually led to the Ontario Federation of Labour disaffiliating from the NDP in 1993. And the Pink Paper unions, led by the Steelworkers, actually led a walkout of, so there's about 1,000 delegates on the Common Front side and about 500 on the Pink Paper side. And on the face of it, you could say that the Common Front were the left wing and the Pink Paper were the right wing. Right? They were, literally, in that sense. But they were both wrong. They were both wrong. And they both... the public sector unions initially participated in the social contract, but eventually walked away. And then the Ray government unilaterally imposed the social contract, using sort of Orwellian language that this was a bargained agreement when it was not bargained at all. But in essence, they walked away, but it was still imposed upon them. And nothing happened apart from the unions disaffiliating from the NDP. There was no strike action, and there was no attempt to mobilise opposition within the NDP. Right? Now, the sources that mention strike action in response to the social contract, in fact, social contract was just as bad as what Harris was doing a few years later, which elicited illegal general strikes. But there isn't much discussion about it in the stuff that I've read. But those that do discuss it say that with the economic crisis, it wasn't a good time to go on strike, and there wasn't much confidence amongst the workers to go on strike. That may be true, although given the sort of liberal or reformist background of the people writing that, I'd want to talk to other people to see if it was possible to organise strike action against the social contract. But they didn't even try. So again, if we were our organisation really stems, our sort of organisational memory really stems from the sort of late 90s, and that was out west in Alberta and BC. We didn't really get going in Ontario into the early 2000s, so we don't really have a direct political organisational memory of this period. But maybe we can talk to people about that. But what they definitely could have done is mobilise within the NDP. So in terms of the social contract, Peter Cormus and two supporters voted against it. Interestingly, both the Liberals and the Conservatives voted against it. Mike Harris voted against the social contract. But it won the NDP caucus was totally dominated by the Ray clique. And of course, this got the wild, enthusiastic support of the corporate press. Finally, Ray's standing up to the unions, and right. And so Ray's thinking, "Oh, I'm so popular. This is great. I'm getting support." Yeah, that's support like the rope supports a hanged man, right? Totally broke the NDP. Totally broke the NDP. But what the unions should have done, they shouldn't have disaffiliated. They should have done the opposite. They should have done a massive campaign within the NDP to say, they were calling for Ray's resignation. Okay, that's well and good. But you move that in every single rating association. You move that in the NDP convention. We have no confidence in this government. And you say that every MPP that votes for the social contract will have a working class socialist candidate supported by the unions running against them in the next election. And that would have made these MPPs think. And it wouldn't have been 3 against, 60 or whoever many MPPs are on the other side. It would have forced up. It's essentially a Jeremy Corbyn tactic, a momentum tactic, if you like. But with running against the candidates and actually demanding a socialist program that against the capitulation, against the social contract. But the irony is, yes, so they were popular. The social contract was popular in the right wing. Of course, it didn't help the NDP in the polls one little bit. It didn't go up in the polls. Actually, the NDP's finance minister, who used to be a left, was a left in the 70s calling for nationalisation. They actually put him in place because he used to be left. And they said it's better to have somebody with a left-wing reputation to put through cuts than someone who was always on the right wing. You've got more credit. You've got to be sold in before you sell out. Otherwise you don't have much political cap. You don't have much to sell, right? And they, but he was quoted as saying, it's like he was speaking to the Toronto Board of Trade or some other corporate audience who was sort of after the social contract, and they were still heckling him and booing him and criticising him. And he said, and he basically said, "Look, we do everything for you, and you still hate us." Of course they do, but they don't. They didn't hate. The leadership of the capital. They understand exactly what the Labour bureaucracy is, what the NDP bureaucracy is, and that's not who they hate. They hate the fucking workers. They hate the workers and the working class base of the NDP. But the unions could totally, have mobilised to remove all of the social contract MPPs and essentially take back the NDP, take over the NDP for the working class and socialism. But of course, what was the difference between the Labour bureaucracy and the NDP bureaucracy? Well, politically, nothing. There's no difference between these people. In fact, all of the Labour bureaucrats had supported Ray's candidacy for leadership. The same people The only difference is where they got their paycheck. So the union bureaucrats got their paycheck from the dues of workers who were being attacked, versus Ray and Co. are getting their paycheck from the state. So, so you had this conflict, but it was a false conflict, and they weren't willing to fight, and they weren't willing to mobilize the workers. Okay, because at the end of the day, the real lesson of this is betrayal is inherent in reformism. Actually, this is not about Bob Ray. Bob Ray is clearly a bastard. We all know that. His both in his period in the NDP and then as a liberal, he's a bastard, always was a bastard. But it's not about that. It wasn't just Bob Ray. It was the whole bureaucracy. It was the whole structure. Right? The fact, numerous NDP cabinet members said, well, you know, I thought about things a certain way in opposition and I was quite naive, but really when we got into government, there was no choice. There were no options. We had to take this action. And that is true under capitalism. This is the limits of reformism. And you saw that with Syriza, the betrayal of Syriza. You saw that with the betrayal of the Notley government in Alberta. You've seen that with the betrayal of the British Labour Party government. The 1929 Labour Party government betrayed. The 1974 Labour government betrayed. Put in wage and price controls in Britain. This is the logic of reformism in crisis. It's not because they're bad people. Ray clearly was a bad person. But it's not because they're bad people. It's because they're reformists, and reformists have no answer for capitalism in crisis. The money has got to be taken from somewhere. And you either take it from the workers or you take it from the bosses. And if you take it from the bosses, that begins an inevitable escalation in the direction of socialism and fundamentally in revolution. And they betrayed on everything. They betrayed on the tax reform, they betrayed on the welfare reform. They even betrayed on the equity that they, responding to sort of homophobic backlash, Ray put, instead of having a whipped vote on equal spousal rights for same-sex partners, he allowed a free vote, and some of the NDP rural backbenchers and even cabinet members, enough of them voted against the legislation that equal conditions for same-sex partners was defeated. Total betrayal. So, you know, when they say, oh, great championer for gay rights, bullshit. They betrayed. They betrayed on pay equity for women because it would cost too much. But what they did do was positive discrimination. Right? So if it was taking from one sector of working class to give to another sector of working class, that's okay. If it's taking from the bosses and the state to give to women generally and to create pay equity, no, that can't happen. But of course, if you can set worker against worker, that's great. But this also played a role in their downfall in working class, blue-collar working class areas like Oshawa and Cole, that the right wing mobilised this to say amongst working class, you know, unionised working class sectors, so-called white male workers. This government is taken away from you, and they were for various different reasons. Right? But it's like no. So and this shows this sort of legacy of sort of petty bourgeois feminism, identity politics, etc. That doesn't want to take on the state, doesn't want to take on the capitalists, but just wants to take from one sector of the workers to give to the other sector of the workers. We say level up, don't level down. take from the capitalist class and level everybody up rather than redistribute at the bottom. Because the bottom, all sectors of the bottom are screwed over.